The morning mist lifted over the fields of Pavia on February 24, 1525, revealing a chaotic scene of steel and smoke. King Francis I of France found himself surrounded by the imperial troops of the Holy Roman Empire, his grand heavy cavalry bogged down in the muddy terrain. The magnificent French gendarmes, usually the masters of the battlefield, struggled against the disciplined formations of Spanish arquebusiers hidden in the trees. Bullets tore through expensive plate armor as the flower of French nobility fell into the wet earth. This was not merely a skirmish, but the decisive moment that would shatter French ambitions in Italy for generations to come. The King of France fought desperately with his sword, but the trap had snapped shut. This violent clash was the culmination of decades of bitter conflict that had turned the Italian peninsula into the primary battleground of Europe. The stakes were nothing less than the domination of the Western world and the control of the wealthy Italian city-states. Italy was the cultural and economic heart of Christendom during the Renaissance, a land of immense artistic achievement and banking power. However, its political fragmentation made it a tempting prize for the rising nation-states of France and Spain. The winner of this contest would dictate the future of the continent, while the loser would be relegated to a secondary power. The Italian people themselves would see their lands burned and their cities sacked in this game of empires. At the center of this titanic struggle stood two men who personified the rival ambitions of their respective dynasties. Francis I of France was a dashing and chivalrous monarch who dreamed of expanding the Valois legacy across the Alps. He saw Italy as his birthright and a gateway to glory. Opposing him was the stoic and calculating Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. Charles controlled a vast empire that encircled France, and he viewed French aggression as a threat to the universal Christian order he sought to uphold. Their personal rivalry went beyond politics. It was a clash of egos that would consume the wealth of their nations and the lives of thousands of soldiers. The question that haunted the courts of Europe was whether the French monarchy could break the iron ring of Habsburg territories surrounding it, or if Spain would establish a hegemony that would last for centuries. Could the wealthy but divided Italian states maintain their independence by playing these giants against one another, or would they be swallowed whole? The intricate dance of diplomacy and warfare involved not just kings, but popes and mercenaries who shifted allegiances with the changing winds. As the conflict dragged on for over half a century, the initial dreams of quick conquest turned into a grueling war of attrition that tested the limits of military technology and financial endurance. To understand how this catastrophe unfolded, we must look back to the year 1494, when the fragile peace of Italy was first shattered. King Charles VII of France, the predecessor to Francis, led a massive army across the Alps, asserting a distant claim to the Kingdom of Naples. His force included a terrifying new weapon, which was mobile field artillery that could smash through medieval castle walls in a matter of hours. The Italian city-states, used to fighting with mercenary condottieri in relatively bloodless engagements, were completely unprepared for the ferocity of the French invasion. Charles VII marched down the peninsula with shocking speed, entering Naples virtually unopposed as the existing political order crumbled before him. The ease of the French conquest sent shockwaves through the royal houses of Europe and alerted Spain to the danger. The Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella saw the French presence in Naples as a direct threat to their own interests in the Mediterranean. They dispatched their brilliant commander Gonzalo de Cordoba, known as the Great Captain, to oppose the French. Gonzalo revolutionized warfare by organizing his infantry into disciplined units that combined pikemen and arquebusiers. These formations would eventually evolve into the famous Spanish tercio, which would dominate European battlefields for the next century. The clash between the French heavy cavalry and the Spanish infantry began to turn the tide in southern Italy. Although Charles VII was eventually forced to retreat, the Pandora's box had been opened. His successor, King Louis XII, continued the obsession with Italian conquest, focusing his sights on the Duchy of Milan. Louis successfully seized Milan and captured its Duke Ludovico Sforza, dragging the unfortunate noble away to a French prison. Louis then made a secret pact with Spain to partition Naples between them, hoping to avoid another direct conflict. However, this partition treaty quickly fell apart due to disputes over boundaries and revenue. War erupted once again between France and Spain in the south of Italy, leading to a series of French defeats at battles like Cerignola and Garigliano. While the foreign powers clashed, the papacy attempted to reassert its own authority over the fracturing peninsula. Pope Julius II, known as the Warrior Pope, ascended to the throne of St. Peter with a sword in one hand and a Bible in the other. He was determined to recover papal lands lost to Venice and to drive the foreign barbarians out of Italy. In a masterstroke of cynical diplomacy, Julius organized the League of Cambrai in 1508, uniting France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire against the Republic of Venice. The Venetian forces were crushed at the Battle of Agnadolo, and the proud republic seemed on the verge of total collapse. However, the shifting sands of Italian alliances soon turned again. Pope Julius II, realizing that the French were now the greater threat to papal independence, abruptly switched sides. He formed the Holy Leg, forcing his former Venetian enemies to join him in a crusade to drive the French out of Milan. This constant realignment of alliances became a hallmark of the Italian wars. No treaty was permanent, and no friend could be trusted. The Swiss Confederation, renowned for their fearsome pike mercenaries, also entered the fray, often selling their services to the highest bidder or fighting to annex territory for themselves in northern Italy. It was into this volatile arena that young Francis I stepped in 1515, immediately after his coronation. Brimming with confidence and a desire to emulate the heroes of antiquity, he led a new French army across the Alps. At the Battle of Marignano, Francis won a stunning victory against the Swiss mercenaries who had taken control of Milan. The battle was so ferocious that a veteran commander called it a battle of giants, compared to which all earlier engagements were child's play. This victory secured Milan for France and established Francis I as the premier monarch of Europe. He seemed invincible, his court a beacon of Renaissance culture and military might. But the balance of power shifted dramatically in 1519 with the death of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. The imperial election became a contest between Francis I and Charles of Spain. Despite massive bribes paid by the French king, the German electors chose Charles. This election united the Spanish kingdoms, the Low Countries, and the Holy Roman Empire under a single ruler. Charles V now encircled France on all sides. The rivalry between Francis and Charles intensified into a personal feud. Francis felt surrounded and threatened, while Charles believed it was his divine duty to lead Christendom, and that France was a stubborn obstacle to peace. The war reignited in 1521, spreading across the borders of France and into the heart of Italy. Imperial forces combined with papal troops drove the French out of Milan once again. The French commander, the Lord of Lautrec, suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Baicaca, where Spanish arquebusiers decimated the Swiss pikemen fighting for France. This battle signaled the end of the dominance of the Swiss pike phalanx and the rise of gunpowder weaponry. Francis I refused to accept the loss of Milan and began preparing for a massive counteroffensive, determined to reclaim his Italian prize personally. This leads us back to the fateful siege of Pavia in 1525. Francis I had marched deep into Lombardy and laid siege to the city of Pavia. He was confident that his heavy cavalry and artillery would crush the imperial relief force. However, the imperial commanders launched a surprise attack at dawn, breaching the park walls where the French were camped. In the confused fighting, the French artillery masked its own fire, and the Spanish infantry utilized the terrain to pick off the French knights. The capture of Francis I on the battlefield was a catastrophe of unprecedented magnitude for the French monarchy. Taken as a prisoner to Madrid, Francis I was forced to sign a humiliating treaty. He agreed to cede vast territories, including Burgundy, and to renounce all claims to Italy. He even had to send his 2 young sons to Spain as hostages to ensure his compliance. However, as soon as he was released and crossed the border back into France, Francis repudiated the Treaty of Madrid, claiming it was signed under duress. He immediately began building a new alliance against Charles V. This new coalition, called the League of Cognac, included the Pope, who now feared the overwhelming power of the Emperor more than the French. The betrayal by the Pope enraged Charles V and led to one of the darkest chapters of the Italian Wars. In 1527, a mutinous imperial army unpaid and hungry marched on Rome. The commander of the army died during the assault, leaving the troops without discipline. The soldiers, many of whom were German Lutherans who viewed the Pope as the Antichrist, breached the walls and subjected Rome to a brutal sack. For days, the Eternal City was pillaged, clergy were tortured, and sacred shrines were desecrated. The sack of Rome shocked all of Christendom and effectively ended the high Renaissance in the city. Pope Clement VII barely escaped with his life, fleeing down a secret corridor to the Castel Sant'Angelo, where he remained besieged for months. The humiliation of the Pope solidified Spanish dominance over the Italian peninsula. The profound psychological impact of the sack marked a turning point in Italian culture, shifting the mood from the optimism of the early Renaissance to a more somber and religious introspection. Meanwhile, the war dragged on, with neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. Francis I even resorted to a shocking alliance with the Ottoman Empire, allowing Muslim ships to dock in French ports to harass Spanish interests. The conflict evolved into a stalemate that exhausted the treasuries of both nations. Armies grew larger and fortifications became more complex, leading to the development of the Tres Italiane, or Star Fort. These new fortresses with low, thick walls and angled bastions were designed to resist artillery fire, making sieges longer and more expensive. The romantic chivalry of the early wars gave way to a grim professional warfare of trenches, sieges, and attrition. The glorious cavalry charges of the past were replaced by the calculated geometry of gunnery and the endurance of paid infantry. As the decades passed, the original protagonists exited the stage. Francis I died in 1547, followed by the abdication of Charles V in 1556. Charles, worn down by constant warfare and the religious schism of the Reformation, divided his vast empire between his brother Ferdinand and his son Philip II. The war was continued by their successors, King Henry II of France and King Philip II of Spain. The focus of the fighting shifted slightly towards the borders of France and the Low Countries, but Italy remained a key theater of operations. The final phase of the wars saw one last attempt by France to assert power in Italy, but it ended in failure. The decisive blow actually came in northern France at the Battle of St. Quentin in 1557, where the Spanish forces won a crushing victory. France was financially ruined and internally divided by the rising tide of the Protestant Reformation. Spain, though also bankrupt, held the upper hand militarily. Both sides were finally ready to sue for peace, acknowledging that the endless conflict could not continue without destroying their respective kingdoms. The Peace of Cadeau-Cambrésis, signed in 1559, marked the official end of the Italian Wars. The terms were a triumph for Spain and a definitive defeat for France. France renounced all claims to territory, in Italy effectively abandoning the dream that had consumed the Valois monarchs for 65 years. Spain was recognized as the dominant power in Italy, directly controlling Milan, Naples, and Sicily, and exerting influence over the other Italian states. The treaty redrew the map of Europe and established a Spanish hegemony that would last until the mid-17th century. The question asked at the beginning was finally answered. France failed to break the Habsburg encirclement and was forced to look inward, dealing with its own religious civil wars. The Italian states preserved their nominal independence but were subservient to Spanish interests. The cultural brilliance of the Italian Renaissance had been dimmed by the smoke of cannons and the brutality of foreign occupation. The peninsula, which had been the vibrant center of the European economy, began a slow relative decline as the center of trade shifted to the Atlantic powers. The Italian wars left a complex legacy. They accelerated the spread of the Renaissance to the rest of Europe as soldiers and diplomats brought back Italian art, literature, and manners. They revolutionized military science, establishing the dominance of gunpowder and the professional standing army. The conflict also forged the modern nation-states of France and Spain, sharpening their national identities through shared struggle. The political geography of modern Europe began to take shape in the crucible of these wars. In the end, the Italian wars serve as a tragic reminder of the cost of ambition. The desire for glory and dynastic supremacy led to decades of suffering for the people of Italy. The beautiful cities of Milan, Florence, and Rome bear the scars of this era in their history. The rivalry between Francis I and Charles V remains one of the most compelling personal duels in history, illustrating how the egos of rulers can shape the destiny of millions. The silence that fell over the battlefields of Italy in 1559 was the silence of exhaustion, not just of peace. The dominance of Spain over Italy would bring a period of relative stability known as the Pax Hispanica, but it came at the cost of Italian liberty. The vibrant, chaotic freedom of the city-states was replaced by the rigid formality of the Spanish court. It would take 3 centuries for Italy to rise again and fight for its own unification during the Risorgimento. The Italian wars were the painful birth pangs of the modern European state system, where the balance of power became the guiding principle of international relations. As we look back on this turbulent era, we see the transition from the medieval world to the modern. The knight in shining armor was replaced by the soldier with a gun. The feudal levy was replaced by the paid regiment. The universal church was fractured by national interests. The Italian wars were the furnace in which the iron of modern Europe was forged, and the sparks from that fire ignited changes that are still felt today. The whisper of time tells us that while empires rise and fall, the human cost of war remains a constant tragedy. From the initial invasion of Charles VII to the final signature at Cato Cambresis, the Italian wars were a saga of shifting alliances, betrayals, and military innovation. They showcased the best of human creativity in art and strategy, and the worst of human cruelty in sack and slaughter. The struggle for the Italian Peninsula was the First World War of the modern era, engaging powers from the Ottoman Empire to the shores of England. It defined the boundaries of power for the 16th century and set the stage for the conflicts of the future. The legacy of the Italian wars is visible in the art of Titian, the writings of Machiavelli, and the fortifications that still stand in Italian cities. Machiavelli himself, writing from Florence during this turmoil, observed that war is the sole art of the ruler. His cynical realism was a direct product of the treacherous environment created by the foreign invasions. The wars shattered the illusion that moral virtue alone could protect a state, teaching the harsh lesson that power is the ultimate arbiter of survival. Ultimately, the French and Spanish battle for control of the Italian peninsula was a contest that neither side truly won in the moral sense, though Spain claimed the geopolitical victory. The immense wealth wasted on mercenaries and munitions could have built universities or cathedrals. Instead, it watered the fields of Lombardy with blood. The Valois and Habsburg dynasties weakened themselves in this struggle, paving the way for the later rise of other powers like England and the Dutch Republic. The story of the Italian wars is a testament to the enduring allure of Italy. Even in its fragmentation, it was the prize that every monarch coveted. Its beauty, its history, and its wealth made it irresistible. The tragedy was that in seeking to possess Italy, the foreign powers nearly destroyed it. Yet the resilient spirit of the Italian people survived, adapting to the new reality of Spanish rule and preserving their cultural heritage for future generations. As the sun set on the 16th century, the roar of the cannons faded, but the political landscape had been irrevocably altered. The medieval dream of a universal Christian empire clashed with the reality of competing nation-states, and the nation-state won. The Italian wars were the crucible of this transformation. They remind us that history is often written in the blood of the vanquished, and that the maps of the world are drawn by the sword. The rivalry of Francis and Charles, the sacks of cities, and the thunder of the arquebus are now distant echoes. But if one listens closely to the history of Europe, one can hear the reverberations of that conflict. It was a time when the fate of the world hung in the balance on the plains of Italy. The whisper of time carries these stories forward, reminding us of the fragility of peace and the relentless march of history. The enduring image of the Italian wars is perhaps that of the captive King Francis writing to his mother after the Battle of Pavia, saying, "All is lost save honor." It captures the fading chivalry of the age, confronting the brutal reality of modern warfare. The Italian wars were the graveyard of medieval chivalry and the cradle of modern statecraft. In that transformation lies the true significance of this bloody century. We leave the Italian peninsula of the 16th century, a land scarred by war but still beautiful in its resilience. The great families, the Medici, the Sforza, the Borgia, played their parts in this drama, alongside the kings and emperors. Their intrigues and ambitions fueled the fires of war. But in the end, it was the changing tide of history that swept over them, all leaving behind the ruins and the masterpieces that we study today. The struggle for Italy was more than a war, it was the defining conflict of the Renaissance. It determined which language would dominate the courts of Europe, which religion would hold sway in the south, and which dynasty would lead the continent. The echoes of the Italian wars are not just historical footnotes, they are the foundations of the Europe we know. The contest between France and Spain for this boot-shaped peninsula changed the world forever. And so the curtain falls on this dramatic epic. The soldiers have long since turned to dust, and the kings lie in their marble tombs. But the story of their ambition and the terrible price paid for it remains. It is a story of human folly and grandeur interwoven in the tapestry of time. This has been the chronicle of the Italian wars, a battle for control that shaped the destiny of nations.